Hey everybody, I want to talk about Sparta and Athens. If you want to follow along, download I think it's Ancient Greece 3, Sparta and Athens. So we're just kind of going to talk about two city-states, the most famous ones in ancient Greece, and kind of see how they're the same and different. If you remember, I told you the polis was basically the city and the surrounding lands. You might think of it as the city and the county would be the polis. That might be a good way to put it. You got the Athenian polis is made up of Athens and Attica. The Spartan polis is made up of Sparta and Laconia. If you look at slide 3, I've got a map of Athens and Sparta. So, like if you click on a couple slides, you can see where Attica is, you can see where Laconia is. So basically, that's where the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta would be. It's not just the city, it's the surrounding land as well. So I want to look at Sparta first, and then we'll look at Athens. And I probably won't go through all the slides, but try to hit the high points with you. Sparta is the militaristic society of ancient Greece. They're the extreme. Everything is militaristic. Sparta's whole existence is based on conquering their neighbors and subjugating them. The mythical lawgiver of Sparta is this guy named Lycurgus. He supposedly gave Sparta a constitution around 750 BC. The Spartan constitution revolved around something called eunomia, which is basically means good order. So basically, the Spartan constitution is very conservative. It's all about structuring society in a way that everything is ordered and fits in its perfect place. So that's kind of Sparta's early origins. Sparta would also be engaged in a constant struggle with their neighbors, the Messenians. And that's who they will conquer. So there's a number of wars, the first Messenian War and the second Messenian War. Don't worry about the dates or anything. But basically, the Spartans conquer their neighbor and then they subjugate them. So the Messenians are going to be slaves to the Spartans for centuries. And this is why Sparta is going to be so militaristic. We have to always be ready because that's how we basically survive, as we subjugate our neighbors. These Messenians came to be known as Helots. Sometimes you hear them called Helots, but these Helots were basically subjects of the Spartan state, so they're slaves. So Spartan society, this is really important. This is kind of what I want you to remember. Spartan society is basically 3 tiers, and you could also think of it as citizen versus non-citizen. So you have the top, these are the Spartiates, these are the Spartan citizens. They're the equals. They're the people over the age of 18. They run Sparta. Everything revolves around them. After the Spartans, you have the perioikoi. These are the people that are not citizens, but they're not slaves. And that word perioikoi just translates as dwellers about. That's one way to put it. And basically, these might have been people who helped the Spartans subjugate the Messenians, but they're not Spartans, so they're not going to be citizens. But they have rights. They're not slaves. At the very bottom of Spartan society, you have the Helots. These are the slaves. They're not citizens. They work on behalf of the Spartan conquerors. That's all they do. The Spartans didn't have to work because they train to be soldiers. And their society basically gets fed by the Helots. So the Spartans do the fighting, the Helots raise the food, and basically do the grunt work, I guess you could say. This militarization of Sparta, this subjugating of the Helots, allows all the male citizens, their only duty is serving in the military. So basically you have a disciplined, lethal fighting machine in Sparta, where all the male citizens who are free, the Spartiates, they fight in the military. And Spartan life is totalitarian. Everything you do is subject to the state. So from birth, the state decides whether you live or die. They would throw infants down this chasm. the apotheti. It's basically where they would deposit the unwanted children. If they're not, if they have a withered arm or something looks wrong with them, they would kill them. Education is supervised by the state. You're basically put in these groups to be educated, the agoge, and you would be trained to become a lethal soldier. There's this group called the Cryptia. These are just it's translated as secret commission. Basically, when you were a soldier in training, you might be sent out to spy on the helots. During certain times of the year, you could kill the helots to kind of keep them subjugated. You're supposed to learn to live off the land, learn physical endurance. So basically, your education was what will make you a good soldier. You'd be married eventually, but you would not live with your wife. You would live with your fellow soldiers. Life as a soldier was not very pleasant. The soldiers ate something called black soup. It was actually some type of boiled blood from an animal. I forget who it is, but there's a famous story about how somebody visits Sparta, and when they eat the Spartan food, they're like, no wonder Spartan soldiers are so brave and willing to die. Like, dying is better than eating this food. So basically in Sparta, if you're brave, if you're tough, if you're strong, then you're highly valued. If you're a coward or you're weak, you're not going to make it very far. So everything that a man or boys or men do is subject to the guidelines of the state. It's the same way with women. Women also are supposed to contribute to the state, and they basically do this through having future soldiers. So your job as a Spartan woman is to birth children who will grow up and be great soldiers or tough men. Women in Sparta didn't necessarily perform domestic labor because the helots would also do this. The Spartans practiced something called marriage by capture. You could go capture a woman, and that was kind of your wife. Marriage in Sparta is not based on love or romance. It's kind of what's good for the state. I got some interesting quotes from Plutarch. I'll let you read those on your own, but it just talks about how the marriage rituals of the Spartans and kind of how they're odd to modern day readers. In Spartan society, there are a couple ways to get your name on a tombstone. And think about it, getting your name on anything in Spartan society is a sign of individuality. Individuality is not something that Spartans are known for, so this is a big deal. The only way to do this was to die in battle or in childbirth. So there were ways for men and women to get, individual praise in Spartan society. Basically, the Spartans end up having a lot of problems. About 1/20th of the population were Spartans, while the other 19/20ths were the helots or the perioikoi. Basically, if you got infanticide, where you throw infants off the cliff or down in the chasm, if you don't live with your spouse, if you're always fighting, you're not going to have very good population growth, so that ends up hurting the Spartans. Spartan government, you don't have to know everything, just kind of want to give you a general background. They had 2 kings, they had 5 ephors, and they had 2 deliberative councils. Basically, the kings are equal in authority. They're kind of a check on each other's power. If there's a military campaign, one king can go off on campaign while the other can stay at home and make sure things function smoothly. Usually the king had military, religious, and judicial powers. They're kind of the moral exemplars to follow, the good examples for your society. I'm not going to read the stuff about the councils. I'll kind of let you look through that. Like I said, you don't need to know everything. Just kind of give you a general idea of what Spartan government was like. The Spartans formed something called the Peloponnesian League. Basically, it's an alliance between them and their neighbors. Okay. Athens is the next city-state I want to talk about. There is kind of this legendary founder of Athens, King Theseus. Maybe a lot of legend kind of into that. But Athens is going to be important because Athens is the polis where democracy is born. But Athens wasn't always a democracy. Around the 6th century, you have men start to call themselves the aristoi, the best men. You have aristocratic government early on. Basically, the story of Athens is the story of the Eupatrids versus the Demos. The Eupatrids are the well-fathered ones. The Demos are the people. So you kind of have this idea of the aristocrats versus the average person. I'm not going to talk about this conspiracy of Cylon. You can kind of read about that. I'm not going to read about Draco. You can read about that. The real person I want to talk about is Solon. He's an Athenian statesman. He's a Eupatrid. He is going to be a big reformer. He draws up a law code in Athens in 594 BC, and I definitely want you to know some of the ideas he promoted in his reform movement. His reform movement is called the Sysaxthia. This basically just means the shaking off of burdens. And if you look at some of the stuff he did, he freed people enslaved for debt. He canceled debt on land. He made enslavement for debts illegal. He brought back Athenians who had been sold into slavery. He encouraged trade. A lot of his reforms have to do with freeing people from going to prison or going to jail or slavery because they couldn't pay their debts. So a lot of it is debt reform. He also had some interesting laws. He would punish people who would not support themselves. Also, parents who would not prepare their children to support them in old age could be punished. He made it so that the average person could bring about charges against the aristocrats. He had the laws inscribed on wooden tablets set up in the agora. That's a big deal. The Romans have something similar. Laws in Western civilization are very important because it's supposedly supposed to hold us to all the same standards. So it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen, a lowly person, a king, or a president. You're supposed to follow the law just like everyone else. Well, for a long time, the average person didn't know what the law was because it wasn't written down. So the Greeks write the laws down, and later the Romans write their laws down and put them in the public square so everyone can see. This is a big step in Western civilization. Solon also created 4 classes of citizens based on wealth. So if you could contribute more than 500 bushels of wealth to society, you were in the upper class. If you were less than 200, you're the lower class. You don't have to worry about that as much. Like I said, a lot of his stuff has to do with debt and economics. You can kind of read about that. There's this really cool story of Croesus and Solon. Basically what happens is after Solon reforms Athens, he travels the world and he ends up meeting Croesus, who's an Eastern king. And basically Croesus shows off all his wealth and is like, who's the best man? Aren't I the best man because I have all this wealth? And Solon basically says, the best men are the men who you have a good family, you're from a good city, you end your life well, you die for something bigger than yourself. Solon basically says, I can't tell you if you've had a good life yet because I don't know how you're going to die. The way you end your life really says a lot about you. And you're actually going to read the story of Croesus and Solon. It's from the book The History by Herodotus. So if you like that story, that's another reason to get the Herodotus book. The most famous tyrant in Athens is this guy named Pisistratus. He basically has 3 attempts where he tries to take over Athens. You'll read about some of those. He eventually does take over Athens, so he's a tyrant. But a lot of people seem to think that he ruled pretty well, pretty fairly. He offers the common men property, prosperity. He lowers taxes, makes loans available to them. In Herodotus, he kind of has good things to say about Pisistratus. He praises Pisistratus. Eventually, Pisistratus dies around 527 BC, and his two sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, take over. That coin, I have a coin there. It's a coin that maybe Pisistratus had Athens starting to mint, because it's got the owl, kind of the symbol of Athens, and it's got alpha, theta, and epsilon, at, he, kind of the start of the word Athens. Basically, Hippias and Hipparchus don't do as well as their father. They end up getting assassinated or driven out of the city of Athens. The next big person in Athenian kind of government is this guy named Cleisthenes. He comes after Pisistratus and his sons. Cleisthenes is the father of democracy. That's an important thing to remember. Basically, after Pisistratus dies and his sons are driven out or killed, Cleisthenes has to think, I have to govern Athens, but how do I balance the aristocrats, the people, the idea of tyranny? Like, how do I govern? So he kind of says, I'm going to have democracy. Everybody's going to have a vote. Everybody can speak. If you're an adult male, that applies to you. So basically that's what he does. Democracy is just what I want you to remember about him. And democracy comes from this Greek word demokratia, which means power of the people. He would have this voting system where you could put a black or white pebble in based on a yes or no vote. I've got a clip here of these discs. These are kind of cool. I don't have the slide number up. I forgot to click it on there, but let me. Well, I won't check. But anyways, you know what slide I'm on. It's these little discs. It says the birth of democracy. If you want to click a short video, click on that link. They're pretty cool. You can see some of these discs, the shafts are solid or hollow. Basically, you would hold them in your hand, and nobody could see whether the shaft was solid or hollow. So when you threw them in the counting bucket or whatever, nobody would know how you voted. It's a pretty cool way to vote. Central elements of Cleisthenes' democracy are the rotation of power. So every year, power shifts hands. You share power with fellow officials, and choice by lot. So if you're going to have a trial and you need to sit on a jury, basically the juries change every day. They have this machine. I think I've got a picture of it, Claroterion. But if you look at that, basically they would never know who the jurists were going to be in any given day. That way, you could never kind of scam the system, because you never knew who was going. You couldn't bribe the jury because you never knew who the jury was going to be. Cleisthenes also introduced this thing called ostracism. Basically, any citizen could get kicked out of the city-state for a period of 10 years if they were considered dangerous. And by dangerous, they might be popular. You want to avoid having a tyrant. So what if somebody is really successful? Maybe you have a really famous military general. Sometimes you might just exile him, ostracize him, not because he's bad. You're just worried he's too popular. There's some pictures of some ostracism clay pots or clay symbols they use to vote people out. There's this kind of cool story about this guy named Aristides the Just. Basically, he's walking one day to ostracize somebody. They're going to have a vote, the city is, and Aristides ends up helping somebody vote to exile himself because he's so honest. You can kind of read the story there. I have it up. Okay, that's really quick introduction to Athens and Sparta. If you want to learn more, I've got 2 video links here at the end of the slides. These are great documentaries. They're pretty long. I think the Athens one is like an hour and a half. The Spartan one might be like 2 or 3 hours. But these will give you a really good understanding of what Athens and Sparta and just ancient Greece was like. You don't have to watch these. These are just, if you want to learn more on your own, go for it. I always kind of like to provide stuff you can study more. So that's kind of Athens and Sparta. I think the next lecture is maybe the Persian Wars, but I'll see you next time.